name's Honeycutt, president and co-founder of New Tesla. Today we're going to talk about an amazing discovery called the quantum cranial advantage. It's based on the use of critical flicker fusion. The quantum cranial advantage was a discovery that we made based upon the research that we did using critical flicker fusion, a technique of measuring the rate at which a flashing light appears to fuse into a constantly illuminated light source. Recent studies in using critical flicker fusion have shown that it is a reliable method to measure the brain's throughput. It also can be used to measure cognitive abilities. Other research in the last few years that's come out is talking about how we can use electromagnetic stimulation to improve brain function as well. New Tesla discovered a way to blend these two different technologies with a unique way of using flicker fusion that hasn't been used in the literature to this date. Now, flicker fusion has been around for over 100 years. One of the most important studies that came out was in 1947, where a researcher studying airmen returning home from World War II that had post-traumatic stress disorder, or basic anxiety is what it was called at that time. They did a comparison between 50 pilots who had anxiety and 50 who didn't. And they set up a room with a projector and a spinning disc that they could adjust the speed that would flash a small dot of light onto a wall. They noticed that the more anxiety a person had, the lower their threshold was where that light would fuse into a solidly lit light. When the person was less anxious, they could see a faster spinning light, faster flashing light source. And they were able to use this method to measure the recovery of these pilots. Now, that particular method had issues with visual acuity, the differences between how each person might see those flashing lights, and those have been addressed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. What's most interesting is the research that was done just a little over a year ago in 2016, where the flicker fusion rate was used as a way to measure your cognitive abilities. You measure your brain throughput. That's literally groundbreaking research that's been going on. There's a paper about flicker fusion and the quantum cranial that you can find on newtesla.com, and we'll post that. In 2008, I met an interesting gentleman. We'll call him Pete. Pete had seen one of the Rhythmetics pendulums, one of our first products that was worn around the neck and used to help balance the circadian rhythms in a person's body through the emission of electromagnetic pulses that were driven from a Fibonacci crystal. Pete commented that the device reminded him remarkably of a similar instrument that he had been involved with back in the late 60s, early 70s, when he had worked with the US government. This device was used purportedly to reduce the effects of mind control using electromagnetic waves based upon the work that was happening at that time with the Russian Woodpecker project. Woodpecker was a shortwave radio emission that sent out a repeating tapping-like sound that was in the 8 to 10 cycles per second. The actual carrier wave was a radio wave in the megahertz range, about 45 megahertz. But this signal would cause people to zone out because it's in the range of alpha brain waves, that brainwave range when we are in a very relaxed and suggestive environment. Pete told me about this device that they used back in the 70s that was worn by top government officials and military individuals, he said, military officers, and they would use this device. They would wear it around their neck like the pendulum, and then 3 times a day they would take the device off, pop a little knob up on top, and twist it, and a red light would come on and start flashing, and they would twist the knob until just the point where the light fused into a solidly lit light. That was their critical flicker fusion threshold. Then they would push the knob back down, which would lock that frequency into place. The light would go off, and then they would be exposed to this electromagnetic pulses that it sent out for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Well, what was happening was the frequency at which your flicker fusion threshold occurs is in the beta brainwave activity range. Your beta waves occur when you're focused and attentive. It's well above the alpha range, and by being exposed to those electromagnetic pulses, it allowed the people that were wearing it to have more immunity, more resistance to any potential alpha wave interference that might have caused them to be the subject of any attempted brain control or manipulation through electromagnetic means or otherwise. He asked me if our devices had flicker fusion, and I told him no, we didn't at the time, but I did some research, discovered a way to simply add it to the products, and made that a part of all of our instruments since that time. It was a few years later when Pete made another astonishing comment about some of the users of this device from the 70s. He commented that Air Force fighter pilots who wore this device reported that they were having fewer speeding tickets, that their response times were faster, that they were doing better on all of their scoring, that they were having fewer incidents in the air or on the ground. And he said it was interesting because they, at the time, didn't realize what was necessarily going on, but one of the things that the pilots had discovered was that if they were to measure their flicker fusion using the knob, take the device off, pop up the knob, twist it till they saw the light coming on, if they held it away from them for just 30 seconds or even a minute, and then brought it back into their field of vision, where the light had been solidly fused into a constantly illuminated source, they noticed that it was now very slightly flickering. And so they would adjust the knob to increase the speed, and the light would go to a solid light. They would take it away from their sight for a few minutes, 30 seconds to a few minutes, bring it back, look at it, and again, it was flickering again. And they would again increase the speed. And this repetitive process would occur for probably 3 or 4 or 5 iterations until there was no more flickering observed after taking the device away from their eyes to look at it. What was happening that we now understand is that the flicker fusion, again, is a measurement of the brain's processing power. And being able to manually adjust it was activating some neural pathways that was actually increasing the pilot's threshold at which they could see this. It was increasing their processing rate. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So what was interesting about this research that he gave me, this information, was that it wasn't at first obvious what was happening, but I knew that having flicker fusion had been an important part of our products. It would flash red at a very high rate and then slow down, and at the point that you noticed it starting to flicker, you would push a button and then it would stop flashing, and then it would report the flicker fusion as a 3-digit number, tens, ones, and tenths of a hertz. So 40.3 hertz, for example, would be a possible flicker fusion frequency. We also discovered that there was a need to reduce the differences in readings between individuals. One of the things that was discovered was the ability to use what's called contrast stimulation. Rather than a flashing light, being able to alter the contrast between 2 different light sources was much more effective. Now, research that was done back in the 60s revealed that our eyes are similarly responsive to both red and blue, even though they're seen with different parts of our eye. And we discovered that by alternating red-blue, turning them one on and then the other off and on, so that the red was on and then the blue and then the red and the blue, while it might appear as violet in color when it's very fast, it allowed us to reduce the differences in the measurement so that we could get a much more precise measurement regardless of the individual that was using it. So we've made those changes to it. Now, one of the other interesting artifacts in all of our research about critical flicker fusion testing that had been done. In every case, the clinician that was conducting the test was the same person who was controlling the flashing rate. So the test subject was in a room. There was a target light source, a background light source that they would view, and then the clinician that was conducting the test would alternately speed up and slow down the flashing or the changing contrast in order to get the persons to say at this point, this is where the light, this is the threshold where it actually began to fuse, so they could adjust it up and down. But the person whose flicker fusion threshold was being tested literally had no control over that mechanism. Contrast that with the fighter pilots in the 70s who were actually adjusting their flicker fusion light source by turning the knob. One of the things that we've discovered is that because we know that the flicker fusion frequency is in the beta range of very active brainwave activity, we're focused, studying intently, on a particular task. And as we are controlling that, we have this eye-hand coordination going on. And there's an interesting phenomenon that was really, I believe, discovered by Nikola Tesla before 1900 about resonance, about resonant energy. Tesla, he discovered that by adding small amounts of energy to a system at its resonant frequency, that those small amounts could become accumulative. They would become additive. They would increase the overall energy in the system. When we allow the person to control their flicker fusion frequency as they're conducting the test, they're able to get feedback to their eyes at what's happening and their hands that are controlling this, and are able to set up this resonance in their brainwave activity level, which is a measure of their processing speed. And so they're getting a resonant boost to their brainwave processing by being able to control this at the same time that they're measuring it. Now, on our instruments, that control is done with two different little push buttons. We call them dome switches on the back of the device. So we'll talk about that in another video about how to actually conduct the test using this. So by allowing the person to actually conduct the test, to control the rate of the flickering up and down and establish that, we're able to create this feedback mechanism and this resonant boost in the person's pathways, their neural pathways, that will increase their processing power. So that using the device, you can measure your threshold, set the device to the aside for 30 seconds to a minute, bring it back into view, and be able to see flickering. And then be able to increase that speed and thereby boost your own processing power, just as these pilots did back in the 70s. New Tesla is also leveraging the latest breakthroughs of what's occurring in transcranial electromagnetic stimulation. All of our instruments emit an electromagnetic pulse or pulses, and we do it at the same frequency as the flashing light in measuring a person's flicker fusion threshold. So by being able to emit electromagnetic pulses at the same rate as the visual stimulus, we have an additive effect, an additional effect of electromagnetic stimulation on top of the visual stimulation that's occurring. So with our instruments, when a person measures their when they measure their critical flicker fusion rate and then place it to the side, the field that is being emitted by that instrument encompasses that person's body, all of their visceral region and their cranial region, and adds to that. So we're getting an additional benefit of doing that. And that's one of the discoveries that we've made. And we call this the quantum cranial advantage because it is literally a quantum leap in the ability, it gives you the advantage to increase your cranium processing power and have that control yourself. Now, there are limits to what you can accomplish, of course, but the ability to be able to do that, to recognize that, to get that feedback and to increase your processing power by observing it and measuring that is an amazing discovery.